Hello， 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。The world is big enough for both of us to thrive. Those were the words of US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen as she departed Beijing following a 4-day visit to China. But Yellen's words before that showed that nothing has changed, and Washington is well known for its forked tongue. China prefers actions over cheap words, especially in the midst of a Biden presidency which has more often than not said one thing and done the complete opposite. Today we'll take a closer look at the Secretary's visit. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. CNN, well known for its scaremongering and biased China reports, ran with a technically promising headline as US Treasury Secretary Yellen headed back to Washington last weekend. The world is big enough for US and China, Yellen says as she concludes Beijing trip. But if that sounds too good to be true, that's because it almost definitely is. Yellen made the remarks following an official 4-day visit to Beijing, where she met with Premier Li Qiang and Vice Premier He Lifeng for in-depth discussions about how the world's two largest economies can move forward. To be clear, what she said is true. The world is big enough for China and the US and everyone else to thrive. In fact, Beijing has constantly made it clear that that is its goal: mutual respect and win-win cooperation. The problem, though, is that that is definitely not what Washington wants. Today, the US is set on painting China as the biggest threat to the current unipolar world order, a world where Washington is the top dog and everyone else exists underneath, allowed to survive only at the good graces of Capitol Hill. The Washington Post laid out Washington's goals for the visit like this. US aims are modest, reviving government-to-government communications that withered amid the pandemic and an increasingly open strategic rivalry. Now, this is already misleading since the most significant cuts in direct communication between the two sides came following former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's arrogant and ill-advised trip to Taiwan last year, followed by the hilariously tragic balloon fiasco earlier this year. While Pelosi's trip served to tie up a personal vendetta she's held against China for decades, it caused significant damage to China-US relations. And the way the US acted over an errant civilian weather balloon was not only embarrassing, but also extremely childish. In my opinion, it would be best if Washington oligarchs, and yes, that includes the stenographers at the Washington Post, admitted this instead of trying to rewrite history. If you can't even admit what you did wrong, how can you change for the better? That's something we've all known since we were children. For some reason, though, Yellen is seen as somewhat of a cute and harmless nana figure in China. And in a way, her trip was seen by many on both sides as a way of mending some bridges and moving forward. A small section of the Chinese internet were interested in Yellen's meal at a neighborhood Yunnan restaurant in Beijing, where she apparently ordered lots of different varieties of Yunnan mushrooms, a specialty that area is well known for. Others commented on her amazing chopstick skills. But when it came down to it, I don't think Yellen really came with any desire to listen to the Chinese side, and was definitely not willing to admit Washington's hideous sanctions and acts of sabotage around the world and aimed at China that aim to snuff out any development outside of the US's sphere of influence. As just one example, Washington is directly trying to stop the modernization and progress of 1.4 billion Chinese people with its international sanctions on the sale of the best computer chips to Chinese companies. That literally forces Chinese IT firms to use substandard chips in everything from phones to personal electronics to electric cars. Now, does that sound fair to you? Does that sound friendly to you? Despite all that, Yellen came to China trying to make out it was China acting badly. She sought to force Chinese entities to stop retaliating against US sabotage by limiting certain products and components that the US desperately needs. In my last video, I talked about how Beijing is planning to better police the export of germanium and gallium, two ingredients in computer chips that the world desperately needs. Now, of course, this annoyed Yellen, despite the move being completely retaliatory in nature. This, according to Reuters. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called on Friday for market reforms in China and criticized the world's second largest economy for its recent harsh actions against US companies and new export controls on some critical minerals. Interesting, the article went on to say. The United States is seeking healthy competition with China based on fair rules that benefit both countries, not a winner-takes-all approach, Yellen told Chinese Premier Li Qiang in a subsequent meeting on Friday. Now, this is just out-and-out crap, and anyone with a fair mind can see that. With all of the hideous sanctions and sabotage Washington is well known for undertaking against its competitors around the globe, based on this disgusting idea that somehow the US is the lord of the planet, it is completely laughable that those words could even come out of her mouth, but they did. And it gets even more unbelievable. She goes on to argue that Washington should be able to keep doing all the hideous things it does to debilitate other economies, and that China should just grin and bear it. She said she hoped her visit would spur more regular communication between the two rivals, and said any targeted actions by Washington to protect its national security should not needlessly jeopardize the broader relationship. So basically what she's saying there is that China needs to sit back and take whatever actions the US decides to utilize to damage China and its goal to make life for 1.4 billion Chinese people better, and not get mad about it. Yesterday she tweeted, I met yesterday with my Chinese counterpart, Vice Premier He Lifeng. We discussed the economic outlook for our two countries, and I raised concerns on behalf of American workers and businesses. We seek an economic relationship that benefits both sides. Now, it is absolutely not true that Washington seeks mutually beneficial relations. History has told us that very, very clearly. China has gone out of its way to engage in fair, mutually beneficial relations and to coexist peacefully, all of which has been snubbed by the Biden regime. I replied to Yellen's tweet saying, Madam Secretary, you are the ones sanctioning and sabotaging the world's progress, and you are the ones who can stop doing that and enter level and balanced relationships with other countries. But the problem remains. Washington is not yet ready to relinquish its position of hegemony and see the rest of the world as equals. So you only have two choices. Step down voluntarily and be part of the New World Order, or be forced down and ostracized. Go and think about it. All we've seen from Yellen's visit is much the same as before. Talk for talk's sake. And like I said earlier, when it comes to the US, China sees talk as cheap. It's all very well for Yellen to create some fluffy headlines professing that her trip was a success, but Beijing is watching for concrete actions. Based on the Secretary's comments, I'm pretty sure that it's just business as usual, and that Washington will continue on its desperate and vicious mission to stop China at any cost. Sending Yellen was just part of the game, a game that everyone outside of the so-called international community can see is nearly up. I asked you all on YouTube what you think Yellen's trip mostly shows. A staggering 94% of you said it shows that Washington still thinks it's the king of the world, while just 6% thought it might represent improving Sino-US relations. Interesting. Anyway, you guys, that's going to be it for today. But as always, I'd love to know what you think. Will Yellen's visit achieve anything? And when will Washington finally realize the game is up? Do let me know down below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.